Hey, AP European History students, this is week 34, and it's right before the AP European History test. And so, the last lecture, the last thing we do in class is we shut down everything else. We shut down homework and tests and projects and everything, and we just take time to prepare for the AP European History test. Because if you want to get college credit for this class, that's what you have to do. You have to take and pass the AP test. If you get a one or a two, you don't get college credit. If you get a three, a four, or a five, you should get college credit. And the AP test scores are accepted at almost every major university in the United States and even recognized internationally. So I think that's really important to kind of focus on and make sure all of us know where we're heading. At the same time, I also think who cares about your AP test score? If you walked out of this class more knowledgeable and less ignorant than when you walked in, well, then we've been successful. That's the truth of it. So there's really two pieces of the puzzle. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle. But if I was to boil it down, this class, to two things, I would say that we hopefully learned how to analyze historical things. And I don't just mean learn facts, I mean analyze them. And the other thing is to be able to understand the geographical concepts. It's impossible to study history without knowing geography and vice versa. So, how and where does things happen? I always try to tell my students it's not just about when, it's about where. Was 1920 a good year? Well, if you lived in the United States, probably it was a great year. It was the roaring 20s. If you lived in Russia or the soon to be Soviet Union, and you had just suffered through World War I, and your country left World War I to have its own revolution slash civil war that killed millions of people, I'd say no, 1920 was not a good year. So it's all about, it's not just the when, it's about the where. It's putting those two things together, it's merging those two. And so I would say those are definitely the core of this class. Now, here's the problem. If all you do is listen to a lecture, your ability to learn is highly diminished. And this year, I've had to record my lectures on YouTube, so not very effective at all. If you did your reading, that could help you learn some things. But again, this is a little breakdown of the learning pyramid, right? You're only going to retain like 10%. Audio visual, well, I've assigned some, crash course YouTube videos, or there's some other ones. At the end of each of my lecture, there's some very good audio visual, presentations that can really help a student learn. If you can demonstrate something, like I can demonstrate something to you, or you could demonstrate, that's two different things. But then our understanding and our learning goes up. If you can have a discussion about it, it's so much better. You retain so much more. If you practice doing something, you retain even more. Ultimately, if you can teach somebody else. So in a typical year, I would get my students into small groups and have them teach each other concepts. If you have the ability to do that, if you have a friend who's taking the AP test, I recommend you form some kind of study group and really start to learn the material, because as you teach somebody else, you learn more. I always learn more than my students as the teacher. And I learned more being a teacher than I ever learned in college, right? Just because of how the human brain works. So ultimately, this European history class is divided into four time periods. The first one starts in 1450 and goes to 1648. So I always ask the question, why? Why does this class start in 1450? You could pause this video right now and you could answer it out loud, and you're going to do more than just if you listened to this lecture. If you could stop and teach somebody else, even if it's an imaginary somebody else, saying it out loud helps you, right? And why does the first time period end in 1648? What happened in Europe in 1648? There was a paradigm shift that changed things, right? That's what we're trying to get to. What are the key topics of Unit 1 and 2? Remember, Unit 1 is the Renaissance and exploration, and Unit 2 is, of course, the Reformation, right? Those are the things that happen in between 1450 and 1648. Period 2, again, as you're kind of reviewing the content, we've been doing this in class and something you've got to do on your own, okay? 1648, that's the end of the religious wars with the 30 Years' War, up to 1815. That seems like a pretty random date. Why 1815? As a European history student taking the AP test, you should know. Oh, yeah, that's the end of Napoleon. Not the death of Napoleon, but the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic era. So, what are the key concepts there? Well, we talked about absolutism and constitutionalism, right? We talked about, say, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and of course, the French Revolution, right? All those things would fit within that categorical time frame. And we have lectures on all of them, and you've done reading, and hopefully now you can talk it and discuss and share. Time period 3, of course, we're talking about 1815, end of Napoleon, up to 1914, the beginning of World War I. And within that time frame, there was two units where we talked about the Industrial Revolution. We also talked about nationalism and imperialism and those late 19th century political changes that really help shape the world that we live in. Right? And then we cover from World War I to the present, and we talk about the world wars, World War I and World War II. And there was conflict in other parts of the world in between, right? Russian Revolution, and of course, the Cold War, which was the prepping and planning for World War III that hasn't happened yet? Question mark, right? I mean, we haven't, but we still got nuclear weapons, and we could still have some serious issues, even up to the European Union and the economic power that Europe still has. So when we get into the present, we're talking about geopolitics. Where something is located affects how it turns out, how its culture is shaped, how its government develops. These are, in my mind, these are some of the most significant dates in European history that an AP Euro student should have, jammed into their head. 1450, the printing press. 1492, Columbus discovers the Americas. 1517, Martin Luther posts his 95 Thesis, the start of the Reformation. 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, maybe the end of the Reformation. 1688, after the English Civil War, they have the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament clearly comes out on top and really starts to dictate that constitutional monarchy, which leads to the America colonies and the American Revolution, and we kind of model our own system after the British. We speak English, right? And then, of course, the French Revolution, epic, huge, right? Really shaking the foundations of Western civilization and what it means to have power in a country and who should be in charge and who should dictate how our lives are lived. The end of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon spreading those ideas of the French Revolution. And it didn't change everything. Remember, after Napoleon, we go right back to monarchies in France, where the French Revolution happened. So even though those revolutions started an idea, it took other revolutions to finish them, right? The 1848 years of revolution, and even that didn't solidify everything. Maybe it wasn't, the world really didn't change until World War One. I mean, that really is the end of the old and the beginning of the new. But before that, in 1871, we get German unification, and Italian unification is also important, but Germany becomes a real powerhouse. World War One changed everything. If I was going to highlight one thing on here, a singular event, that would be it. It's such a game changer. And I know that World War II is bigger, but World War One is the end of the old and the beginning of the new, and it really shapes the world we live in today. So amazingly significant. The Russian Revolution ushers in communist countries instead of just a political or theoretical idea. The Russian Revolution really puts it into place. World War I ends. World War II starts and ends. You can see the dates right here. There's huge protests and riots that are happening during the Cold War in 1968. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, and in 1991, the USSR, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, dissolves, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the Cold War ends. And right after that, the European Union is created. Anyways, if we had to boil it down to, those are some of the most significant things. And somebody watching this video or who's a student of European history might say, oh, dude, you totally missed this. And what about that? There's only so much room on a slide, right? That's why we have an entire year, theoretically 180 days. That's how long a school year is, 180 days to learn the content. But as I've said lots of times, it's not so much the memorization of facts as it is changing your perception and your perspective. Understanding how we see things and how they change over time, right? How we view things changes over time and across different cultures. That's an important skill for all of us to learn and to understand our place in the timeline of history. And remembering that history doesn't start at the zero mark. Even though right now we're in 2021, history didn't start at the zero mark. That's a cultural, religious construct that's not seen the same way in every country around the world. If you remember back to the very beginning of this class, I had this little experience the first time I went to Africa, to the country of Morocco, and I was going to rent a car in Morocco to go explore the Sahara Desert, on the east side of the Atlas Mountains. And I looked at this guy's calendar, and his calendar said something to the effect of 1423. And this was the year 1998 on the Christian calendar, although I don't necessarily think I would have said the Christian calendar. I just thought it was the calendar. And how this guy said, oh, well, you come from a Christian country. And I was like, well, yeah, a lot of Americans are Christian, but I never thought of it as a Christian country. And he says, in our country, it's an Islamic country, and we follow, the Islamic calendar. So during the 600s AD on the Christian calendar, the Prophet Muhammad left Mecca and went to Medina, and that's when the Muslim calendar starts. But it's also a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar like we have, so the dates don't always line up. That's when it gets fascinating. That's when you realize that history is all about perception, and there's not necessarily a right answer. And this literally kills some people. Some people love history because of this, and some people hate it. Some people love math because 2 + 2 always equals 4. Always. But in a history class, in a social science class, the answer is not necessarily right. It's really our opinion, but backed by facts, it holds some weight. And so all good academic essays follow a pattern of you make a claim. You answer the prompt that's given to you. And then you provide evidence, data, and you tie it together with a logical connection. And that is what we've been trying to do in this class, because it doesn't matter how well you know your history. You can't pass the AP test if you can't prove it on paper, if you can't put together a solid, good argument. So what's on the AP exam? Well, this AP course, as a review, you go back to the very first week, you can see that I've been trying to teach this the entire year. There are seven overarching themes that will be on this test. There's the interactions of Europe and the world. That's geography in one word, right? How has Europe impacted the world? Well, I live in North America. My ancestors are European descent because I'm white, and I speak English, right? A European language. And so I think that's really, really significant to pay attention to. How does Europe interact with the world? How does it influence and impact the world? And also, how does the world impact them? There's economics and commercial development. You know that the world is driven by economics, whether that's capitalism or mercantilism or communism. Okay? Economics drive the world. It's an incentive. That's why I have a job, right? Because I want to get paid, because I not really care about money, but I do care about putting food on the table for my kids, right? I want them to be able to go to college. So I know that's going to cost some money. Why do I want them to go to college? Because they have a better statistical probability of getting a higher paying job, right? We don't go to college because we love to learn. I know that sounds hurtful, but really, we go to college because we feel like we're going to get a better chance at making more money per hour, or having salary over hourly rates at a job, right? A more fulfilled life. That's why we have this AP class, right? Not because people love taking tests and writing term papers, but because they feel like this will help them out financially, right? Economic development and commercial development. And then, of course, we're looking at cultures and the different cultures of Europe, the German culture, the French culture, Italian culture, English culture, Spanish culture. I mean, and the Slavic culture in Eastern Europe. And of course, I just missed a whole bunch of European countries, but it's fascinating to see the intellectual development and movements of the Enlightenment and the sciences, and how those things shape culture. We looked at states and other institutions of power like the church. When I say the church, there's only one the church, and that's the Catholic Church. But we also looked at how people branched off for political or spiritual reasons, sometimes even for economic reasons, and how governments changed from these feudalistic societies of medieval times. These new monarchies developed into absolute monarchies, which in some places transformed into constitutional monarchies, to republics, to democracies. I mean, those things shift, right? We looked at social organization and marriage patterns, and how, what is right and wrong in a society is oftentimes dictated by the cultural and philosophical ideas and religious ideas flowing in that country. What's the right age to get married? If we looked at, say, England in the 16 or 1700s, the marriage age and acceptable marriage time, people today go to high school until they're 18 years old. You go rewind the clock 200 years, and if you were 18 years old and not married as a woman, you might be starting to look like an old spinster, right? National and European identity. What does it mean to have a country and to feel proud and to feel patriotism, or to feel loyalty, to put your life on the line for France? There's Americans who will literally bleed red, for the flag of the United States because they feel a patriotic duty to a construct, right? This construct that is the United States. And so we look at each European country and how those identities form over time. And of course, we cannot ignore how technology and science has changed over the past 500 years, because ultimately that's what we're doing in this class. The AP exam will test your ability to conceptualize historic concepts and to analyze them, not just to memorize facts, but to work with those facts, to digest them, and to show reason and logic, right? AP history students need to use reason and logic to investigate major time periods and to understand historical continuity and change, and to make comparisons among various historical components and in different times and places. To learn history, you must be able to think spatially and chronologically. Chronologically is the order events happen in and how cause and effect relate to each other. And the spatial part is the geography part. So it's something I've pushed in my class a lot. And any of my students should be able to look at the world differently than they did when they first came in, right? Seeing where things happen and seeing the order and when things happened. It's impossible to separate geography from history. You can't understand one without the other. Now, there are 6 historical thinking skills. One is not more important than the other, but one of the things we tried to do is to show you how the development of history, how things develop over time, and the process to how things happen. That's taking facts and tying them together. Also, one of the things we have to be able to do is to source and cite things. That is, we don't just wing it. We don't just throw out random facts as if everybody just agrees with us. But we also have to be able to say, this is where I get my data from, right? And so that's why we work a lot with what DBQs, right? Looking at a piece of evidence and being able to understand where it came from, how credible is it. That's a major deal in this class. And of course, number three, making claims and providing evidence from sources, right? That's ties that sourcing and citation together. Remember, on your DBQ, you always have to cite where you're getting your information from, right? On an LEQ, there's no document to cite, but that's why we have to describe it accurately so that anybody who studies history is like, oh, I know what they're talking about, right? Contextualization, remember, context is everything. Context is everything. If I say my grandpa killed a man and I left it there, you might have some serious issues in your mind about what my grandpa, who he was, what kind of a person he was. But if I add even a little bit of context, like when, say, June 6th, 1944, and I even add a little more context, like a place, Normandy, and I even give you a little bit of background as to what he was doing, like he grew up in the 1930s, and by the time it was the 1940s, he was old enough to join the U.S. Army. Then you're like, oh, now he went from maybe a scoundrel in your mind to maybe a hero. Maybe he was one of those GIs who stormed the beaches of Normandy, and fought in World War II. So if you add context to something, you're giving us the essential background information to make us care about listening to you, right? Now, when we make the connections, okay, when we're making the connections and we're using historical reasoning, okay, historical reasoning process is only, there's only three choices on when you're writing an essay in a history class. In a science class, it might be different, but in a history class, there's really just three possible choices. When I say claim, evidence, reasoning, it's either compare and contrast, or it's show cause and effect, or it's to demonstrate the continuity and the change over time. But all of the writing that we do is very argumentative because there's not necessarily a right answer. And that is a huge deal, right? That's a huge deal. A huge deal. Our job in the AP test is to prove that we are critical thinkers, not a brain packed full of facts. So, I mean, if you looked at the United States of America and I said, well, the United States has the world's largest economy, and you knew that fact, you might not understand what you really know. You might not understand that the state of California by itself could compare to the GDP of Great Britain, the fifth or sixth, depending on which year you look at the data, biggest economy on the planet Earth. And that even though Canada is bigger geographically, the state of Texas makes more money, or comparably big amount of money. But there are more people that live in California than the country of Canada. And so it's not about memorizing facts. It's about being able to take those facts, play them off each other, and to show real intelligence. That's the concept we're going for. So what's on the AP test? There's 55 multiple choice questions in 55 minutes, and it's 40% of the test score. Okay? Questions come in a set and are tied to a stimulus. That means a art piece, a photograph, a small entry from a journal, a chart, or a graph. Okay? And usually they'll come in sets of like three or so. That's usually the typical number. So 55 multiple choice questions in 55 minutes, you've got to move. So there is some strategy involved here. If you don't know the answer to a question, you need to move on. Right? You need to move on and come back to it if you have time. I hate it when students spend a ton of time on a question they don't know, and later they have to guess on a question they did know. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you spend a ton of time on a question you don't know, you wasted your time. You should have just guessed, and you should have got to the final questions that maybe you knew the answer to. So time management may be one of the most important skills for you to get college credit on this test. There are three short answer questions, and by short answer questions, I mean they have three parts, generally listed as A, B, and C, and in your answer, you should list them as A, B, and C, so it lines up. The points are independent. There's no rubric. It's just, did you sufficiently answer the question with enough detail to garnish the point? And that's 20% of your test score. Okay, the questions always have 3 parts. The first 2 questions are required, but you get to choose between question 3 and 4. So they'll actually give you 4 questions. You only need to answer 3 of them. Again, if you don't listen to what I'm saying here and you try to answer all 4 of them, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because they're not going to grade all 4 of them. So you just wasted your time. And if you don't know one of the questions, you should skip it and spend more time on the ones you do know. Come back to the one you didn't know later. So if I could say this the right way, say you looked at question 1 and 2, and question 1 you really are comfortable with, and question 2 you have no idea how to answer it, then I think you should answer question 1, skip question 2, pick between 3 and 4 which one you know, and then go back to number 2 if you have time. It's all about time management. If you spend more time on the ones you know, then you're guaranteeing yourself points. Okay, everybody has to do a DBQ. It's an essay, a 5-paragraph essay. It's 25% of the test score. You have an hour to do it. That means you have 15 minutes to prep, somewhere about 45 minutes to write, depending on how much time you want to save at the end to do some, looking back over it, proofreading it. But we're not talking about grammar mistakes. We're talking about rubric points. And if you don't know what the 7 points are, then you're not going to include them in the essay. That means you could write an entire essay and not score any points. So you've got to pay attention to the rubric and address what they're asking you to do. Remember, the first point is context. The second point is a claim. The third point is you describing the document accurately. And the next point is using that document to back up your claim. The next point would be if you could hippo or analyze the document. Hippo is just an acronym to help you remember how to analyze. And then you've got to bring in a piece of outside evidence and then show complex understanding. Those are the 7 points, and you've got to know them by heart. The last part of the AP test is an LEQ. It's 40 minutes. It's 15% of the test score. It's almost the exact same points. They're going to give you 3 options, like 3 questions. You only pick one of them. And the points are almost the exact same as the DBQ, except there's a greater emphasis on the reasoning process, proving mastery of the skill. And of course, there's no documents to read, so you have a shorter amount of time because you don't have to take the time to prep the documents, know how to use them, know how to organize them. You just get to pull the facts from your head. So that could be good or bad, but you get to include what you know. And if you don't know it, you can exclude that, right? So it kind of should play to your strengths. The 6 points, of course, are the context and the claim. And then you still describe and support with your evidence. You just don't have docs to use. And of course, there's that reasoning piece where you're analyzing one of those 3 reasoning strategies of compare and contrast, or cause and effect, or continuity and change over time, depending on what the question wants you to use. So there's an extra emphasis on that. And of course, the complex understanding. So the rubrics are very similar on the 2 essays. Hopefully by now, the world looks different to you than it did when you first joined me. It's interesting how we have maps that look like this that are showing political boundaries, the human side of it, and yet this is probably more what the world really would look like, right? With deserts and green areas, with rivers and oceans. The natural color, ice covering the northern parts and the high mountains. We sometimes think this is what the world looks like because these are the human lines we've drawn, showing political boundaries of the world. Geography matters. Every person who calls themselves an American had their family come to this country at one point in history from somewhere else. Some were forced to come. Some came hundreds of years ago. Some only a couple of months ago. But world history requires a knowledge of geography because of immigration and migration. And how does this affect an event, a people, a culture, your life? How much of history is affected by place where things happened. One of the most important ideas in history is that things are going on in different places at the same time. We're just one country, and sometimes we overemphasize the importance of the United States. We're just one sliver in the giant piece of the puzzle that is the history and the story of humanity. And remember, the word history has the word story in there, right? So if you understand our planet, how many days are there in a year? Oh, that's right. There's 365 and 1/4 days. What? How is that even possible? I don't remember any year ever having 1/4 of a day. That's because every 4 years we put it all together into one day. But still, it's not quite a fourth, so our calendars get slightly off. That's why we have leap year, right? Today we use the Gregorian calendar. Did you know that? Did you know it's based off of the Julian calendar, right? Do you know it's based off of the Christian ideology? Weather and season of our planet is caused by the tilt of the earth. Remember, if you've ever looked at a globe, it's always slightly tilted. That's because in relationship to the sun, the planet Earth is slightly tilted at 23.5 degrees. And that causes all the weather patterns and climates on the planet Earth. And it affects ocean currents, and that affects trade routes. And right, geography affects us. Where something happened is just as important as when. One of the most important ideas in history is that things are going on in different places at the same time. Oh, you just said that, Mr. Moore. It's because it's true. In geography, we need to pay attention not to just location. There's absolute location and relative location. If you give me latitude and longitude, or you use GPS, I could tell you exactly where I am. But in relation to something else affects the culture. If you live in a state that's right next to Mexico, it affects the language, the street signs, the food, the restaurants, right? People's attitudes. If you describe a place, that's not necessarily the location, but what it looks like, and you describing it, right? The cultural region area, right? If I say Latin America, I use that in a history class, or I say the Middle East. Those things should have a context, or Eastern Europe, or Sub-Saharan Africa, right? We use these kind of ideas, Scandinavia, the Balkans, right? Or there's also movement is one of the major themes, and how where people shift, people migrate and shift, and boundaries of countries shift. And then people, how they interact with the environment affects how we turn out. Okay. Um, there are key terms to understanding our world. If I use the word continent versus the word country versus the word state, oh my goodness, you could have a whole philosophical discussion on how many continents are there, because Europe, Asia, and Africa are literally connected by land. And yet they're so vastly different that we divide them into 3 different chunks. North and South America are connected by land, right? And what does it mean to be a country? Is East Timor a country? Is South Sudan a country? Is Kosovo a country? Those are some of the newer ones that have popped up on the map lately. But nobody doubts that France is a country. And what does it mean? And sometimes we erroneously use the word state. We talk about the Baltic states. Those are countries. And yet the states in the United States are not really states, because they're not sovereign political entities. And yet what really affects us might be the city we live in, or the countryside. And then we get into some geographic terminology like the equator, right? That dices the earth between north and south, or the lines of latitude, right? Like the rungs of a ladder that go east to west but measure north and south, or the prime meridian. Why is the prime meridian? Where does it go through? Why do all clocks on the planet Earth revolve around time in London? That's history, right? The prime meridian is supposed to be the marker between east and west. We refer to things as east or west according to the prime meridian. So these lines of latitude and longitude kind of help us to distinguish where we are and put some relative idea of geography on us, right? Today we use satellites, cell phones, and we have Google Maps and Apple Maps, and though there's all kinds of maps, so different than it was in the birth of exploration in the 1400s when Europeans were going out there and they didn't really know where they were going, right? And they didn't have good cartography back then. And what does the Earth really look like? Because so many times we take the spherical object and try to put it on a flat map to try to understand where we are. So, what's the bottom line? If you can prove you've got a brain and you can not just listen to the lecture and not just listen to audio visual, but if you can demonstrate, if you can practice, or if you could even teach others what you've learned. Every time you share a lesson from this class with a friend, with your family at dinner, you are going to retain the information 90% more than if you just listen to a lecture, especially if it's on YouTube and there's no interaction. But thank you for being here this year. Thank you for sticking it out. Thank you for engaging and being productive. And I hope that you have learned something and that you walk away more knowledgeable and less ignorant than you did when you first started this class. Thank you for being here. I'm Mr. Moore, and this is the last lecture of the AP European History class. There's a couple weeks left in class. And of course, there's always some great videos that I have found online that I've posted in here that I hope will help you learn the material and be, more engaging than just me talking at the screen. But the next couple weeks, we're going to be taking the AP test and finishing our review. We might do a couple projects in class, but there's no more content that I'm going to cover. I've covered the content, and I hope now you can demonstrate that you've learned the content. And just wanted to thank you all for this year, and look forward to helping you to be successful. Peace out.